The baby in her left arm had stopped crying 20 minutes ago. Evelyn Harper told herself that was a good thing, that he was sleeping, that the quiet meant peace, not what she was truly afraid it meant. She told herself this while she pressed her palm flat against his chest and felt the shallow, too slow rise and fall beneath her fingers. And she told herself this while the fire in the hearth burned itself down to a thin orange thread. And she told herself this right up until the moment she couldn't tell herself anything anymore. The wood was gone. Not running low. Gone. She had burned the extra chair 3 days ago. She had burned the small table her husband Daniel had built the first summer they arrived in Colorado, the one he'd been so proud of, the one with the slightly uneven leg he always meant to fix. She had burned the crate they'd used to store flour, and the second crate after that, and the old wool blanket that had been too thin to sleep under anyway, but at least could feed a flame for 20 minutes. She had burned everything she could break apart and carry without putting the babies down, and now there was nothing left that would burn, and the fire was dying, and outside the wind was doing what it had been doing for 11 days. Screaming. Her name was Evelyn Harper. She was 24 years old. She had been a widow for 6 days. The second baby, the girl, made a small sound against Evelyn's right shoulder. Not crying, more like a question. Evelyn turned her face down toward her and said, in a voice that came out steadier than she felt, I know, sweetheart." She didn't know what else to say. She wasn't sure sweetheart was even the right word for an 11-day-old child who had never heard her own name spoken aloud by her father, because her father had managed 4 days before the fever took him. And in those 4 days, he had mostly been unconscious. And in the brief hours he was not, he had held each of them once and said that they were beautiful. And then he had died with a quietness that still didn't seem real to Evelyn when she thought about it, which she was trying very hard not to do. She shifted toward the hearth. The last coal pulsed once, weakly, like something trying to hold on, and then it dimmed. The cold that rushed in to replace the warmth was immediate and absolute. Evelyn sat there on the floor with her children and did not move. She had been so certain, when they'd packed up everything in St. Louis 8 months ago, that she was the kind of woman who could handle whatever came. Daniel had said the same thing. "You're the toughest person I know, Evie, and I've known some tough people." And she had believed him, and she had been largely right through the whole impossible first year. The broken wagon axle in Kansas, the weeks when they'd eaten mostly cornmeal and dried beans, the loneliness that had settled over her like weather. She had handled it, she had held on, but she had not planned for this. She had not planned for twins, for one thing. No one had told her there were two until they were both already in the world, arriving in the middle of the worst blizzard she had ever seen, with only herself to manage it. She had not planned for Daniel to go 4 days later. She had not planned for 11 consecutive days of snowfall that had buried the door to her shoulders when she'd tried to push it open this morning. Had not planned for the moment. She'd realized there was no more wood and no way to get any, had not planned for the specific terror of understanding that no one knew exactly where she was and that no one was coming. The settlers at the trading post were 30 miles east. 30 miles in this weather was not a distance. It was a sentence. She looked at the ceiling. There was a crack running along one of the beams that hadn't been there in October. The weight of the snow on the roof had done that. She had noticed it 4 days ago and told herself it was fine. The beam was still solid. It would hold. She was less certain of that now. "All right," she said, to herself, to the room, to no one in particular. She didn't know what she meant by it. She must have slept, because she woke with her neck at a terrible angle and the pale gray of early morning pressing through the one window that wasn't completely buried. Both babies were still. She checked them the same way she had been checking them every time she woke, palm flat, waiting, both breathing. She closed her eyes briefly and breathed herself. The temperature had dropped in the night to something that didn't seem possible inside a structure with 4 walls. Her breath came out in a solid cloud. The tips of her fingers were numb despite the blanket she'd wrapped around all 3 of them. And the blanket wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. She had known yesterday it wasn't enough. But there had been nothing else to do. She needed fire. She needed fire, or they would not see another night. She looked around the cabin with new eyes, desperate eyes, inventory eyes. She had already burned everything she could reach, but she had not burned the 2 boards nailed across the inside of the door for reinforcement. She hadn't burned them because she needed them, because without them the door might not hold against the wind. But the wind wasn't the thing that was going to kill her today. The cold was. The cold that was already inside the cabin with them. She laid the babies in the center of the bed, wrapped in everything she had, and she got up on legs that felt like they'd been filled with sand, and she found the hammer on the peg near the fireplace where Daniel had always kept it, and she started on the first board. The nails were in deep. She wasn't strong enough to pull them straight out. She had to work the claw back and forth, until the wood started to give, and it took longer than she expected, and her hand shook the whole time, but she got it. She pried the first board free, broke it across her knee, fed the pieces into the hearth. She got the fire started with the last of the matches. She had been so careful with the matches, so obsessively careful, rationing them as though each one was a meal. And she sat back and watched the flame take hold. The baby girl made a sound. The baby boy stirred. "Still here," Evelyn said. "Both of you, still here." She said it like a fact, like a promise, like something she actually believed. The fire bought her maybe 4 hours. By mid-morning, it was failing again, and she had used the second board, and the door was now hanging at an angle it hadn't hung at before, and she sat on the floor and held her children and thought, with a clarity that scared her, that this was probably the last day. She wasn't being dramatic, she was being accurate. The food had run out 2 days ago. She'd been surviving on melted snow and the last of a sack of oats she'd watered down until it was barely oatmeal anymore. Her body had no heat left to generate. The babies were nursing, but she didn't know how much longer she could sustain that. She hadn't eaten a real meal in days, and she could feel herself hollowing out from the inside. There was no more wood. There was nothing left to burn. The temperature outside was the kind of cold that killed healthy men. She thought about Daniel, not the dying part. She tried not to think about that part, but the part before, when he had been himself. The way he'd tilted his head when he was thinking through a problem. The particular sound of him moving around in the mornings. The quiet domestic sounds of someone who moved through a space without thinking about it because it was his. She missed the sounds more than she'd expected. The cabin was so quiet without him, except for the wind, which was not peaceful quiet, but a violent, indifferent quiet. She thought about her mother, back in Ohio. She thought about the letter she had written in September that her mother probably still hadn't received. She thought about all the things she hadn't said in that letter because she hadn't wanted to worry anyone. She was not going to write another letter. That thought arrived not with grief, but with a strange flatness, like a fact she was just now seeing clearly. She was 24 years old. She had come 2,000 miles. She was going to die in a cabin in Colorado because she had run out of wood in a blizzard, and her children were going to die with her, and no one would know until spring. She pressed her face against the top of her daughter's head and breathed in the smell of her. That particular newborn smell, warm and faintly sweet, that she hadn't expected to love as much as she did. And she did not cry, because she was past crying, and because she needed whatever moisture was left in her body. Then she heard the sound. It was not a big sound. That was the strange thing. Given what it turned out to be, given everything that followed from it, the sound itself was almost nothing. A muffled thud from somewhere near the door, then another, then a pattern that could have been footsteps in deep snow. Evelyn did not move. Her first thought was an animal. Elk sometimes came close to the cabin, driven by the same desperation she felt, and once in October she'd heard a mountain lion somewhere near the woodpile that had made her stay inside for a full day. Her second thought was that she was hearing things. People did that, she knew, when they were cold enough and desperate enough. They started hearing things. They started seeing things. But the sound kept coming, deliberate, rhythmic, getting closer. She put the babies in the center of the bed and picked up the rifle from the corner. She had 3 cartridges left. She'd been saving them for, she wasn't sure. An animal getting through the door, maybe. Some last emergency that was apparently not as last as this one. She stood to the side of the door, the way Daniel had always told her to stand if she ever had to open it to someone she didn't know. And she waited. And the footsteps stopped just on the other side. And then a voice came through the wood. "Hello in the cabin." A man's voice, low, not loud, like someone who didn't want to startle her. Evelyn said nothing. "I'm a hunter. I saw your smoke from up on the ridge." A pause. "Not much smoke. I want to help if you need it, and I'll walk away if you tell me to." She looked at the dying fire. She looked at her children on the bed. She thought about the 3 cartridges and the fact that even if this man was dangerous, she had nothing left to lose by opening the door. "Step back from the door," she said. Her voice came out rough, cracked from days of barely speaking. "Stepping back," the voice said. She lifted the door. It caught, the bottom dragging on the warped frame, and she had to put her shoulder into it, and then cold air hit her like a wall, and there in the gap she'd made was a man standing several feet back in snow that came to his thighs, his hands away from his body, palms turned out. He was tall, dark hair, dark eyes, a coat that looked like it belonged to the land itself. He had the particular stillness of someone who was not afraid. He looked at her, at the rifle, at her face, at whatever her face was showing him, and he didn't move. "You alone?" he said. "I have children," she said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "How old?" 11 days. He looked at the gap in the door behind her. She watched him understand what he was seeing, no fire smoke, no warmth coming out, a woman with a rifle who weighed less than she should. "How long since the fire's been right?" he said. "Yesterday morning." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "My name is Rowan Blackhawk. I know this territory. I can help you, but not if we stay here." He held her eyes. "Will you let me come in and talk?" She let him in. Not because she fully trusted him. She didn't. She let him in because she had done the math, and the math had only one answer. He moved through the cabin the way people move when they are used to reading spaces quickly, taking it in without seeming to stare, noticing things. He noticed the absence of wood. He noticed the pried boards from the door, the hammer still on the floor where she'd left it. He crouched by the hearth and looked at what was left of the fire, which was almost nothing, and he reached into the pack on his back and produced a wrapped bundle that turned out to be birch bark and a handful of dry tinder, and he had a flame going in 2 minutes that looked more solid and more real than anything she'd managed in days. She hated how much relief she felt at the sight of it. He stood up and looked at her. He was probably 30, she thought, maybe a few years older. There was something deliberate about the way he stood, like a man who had learned not to make large movements around frightened things. "Tell me about the children," he said. "Why?" "Because I need to know what shape they're in to understand what we're able to do." She studied him. "What are you suggesting we do?" "Move." He said it simply, like the answer was obvious. "This cabin is going to kill you. The roof is compromised." He glanced up at the crack she'd been watching for 4 days. "And you have no resources left. There's a settlement 2 days' travel from here if we go the right way. People. Food. Shelter that isn't failing." 2 days? She said. "In these conditions, yes." She looked at her children on the bed, 11 days old. She thought about carrying 2 newborns through whatever was outside that door, and almost said no, almost told him to leave, almost chose the familiar slow end over the terrifying uncertain one. "Whose settlement?" she said. He met her eyes without blinking. "My people. My mother's kin." She had known, looking at him, that there was native blood there. She had known, and hadn't asked because it hadn't seemed like the moment. But now he'd said it himself, plainly, like a fact she could take or leave. "Will they—" she started. "They'll let you in," he said. "I can't promise more than that. You'll have to earn the rest." "That's honest." "I try to be." She looked at him for a long moment, this stranger who had appeared out of a blizzard, this man who had no reason to help her, and had helped her anyway. She thought about Daniel, who had also been a man who helped when he didn't have to, and she thought about how the world produced such men occasionally, without warning, and how you couldn't always tell the real ones from the imitations. "If we go," she said, "and something happens to me, I won't let it." "You can't promise that." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he agreed. "I can't. But I can tell you that I've crossed this territory in worse conditions, and I know what I'm doing, and you and those children are going to be my only concern until we get there. That's all I can offer." The fire crackled. One of the babies made a sound. The girl, who seemed to have more to say than her brother. Evelyn crossed to the bed and picked her up and stood there holding her and looking at Rowan Blackhawk, this stranger in her cabin, and made the hardest decision she had made in a life that had recently become full of hard decisions. "When do we leave?" she said. "As soon as you can be ready," he said. "Ideally before the next front moves in. We have maybe 3 hours." She had not thought, until that moment, about what taking the babies out into a blizzard actually required. She had 3 hours to think about it intensely. Rowan helped without being asked. not intrusively. He moved around the edges of what she was doing, filling her water bladder with melted snow, adding to the fire, reassessing the pack on his back and redistributing its weight. He told her what she needed to bring and what she needed to leave, and he was right about almost everything, which irritated her a little even as she appreciated it. She wrapped the twins in every layer she could, strips torn from blankets tied against her body so they would take her warmth. It was not elegant. She looked, when she was done, like something built rather than dressed. Rowan looked at her work and made 2 adjustments, tightening a tie on her left side, repositioning the boy so his face wasn't pressed against fabric, and did it without asking permission, which, under other circumstances, she might have found presumptuous, but he did it with a practicality that made it feel like carpentry rather than anything else. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes." "Far?" "I don't know. I haven't eaten properly in 3 days." He pulled something from his pack and handed it to her, dried meat. She ate it without asking what it was, and didn't think about the fact that she was eating from a stranger's hand until after she had swallowed it. "More when we stop," he said. "Not too much at once." "I know." He looked at her. "I know you know. I'm telling you anyway because when you're cold and hungry, your judgment about your own body isn't reliable." She wanted to argue. She didn't, because he was right. She took one look around the cabin before they left. At the table Daniel had built, at the crack in the beam, at the hearth where she'd sat for 11 days trying to keep her children alive with whatever she could find to burn. "Come on," Rowan said, not unkindly. She walked out into the snow, but the cold outside was a different thing entirely from the cold inside the cabin. The cold inside had been a presence, a slow thief. The cold outside was an opponent, active, directional, pressing against every surface of her at once. The wind had dropped somewhat from its peak, which Rowan had said was why today was the day to move, but somewhat was relative. It was still the kind of wind that found the seams. She couldn't see more than 40 feet in any direction. The world was white and gray and formless, and she understood for the first time, viscerally, why people got lost and died in conditions like this. Not because they were foolish, but because the landscape gave you nothing to orient by, nothing to measure yourself against. Rowan moved in front of her, breaking the path. He was not fast. He was methodical, each step deliberate, choosing the way through drifts rather than over them where he could. She watched his back and followed exactly where he had stepped, because his steps were right and hers would have been less right. 40 minutes out, the baby boy started crying. It was the most he'd cried since he was born, a sustained, furious crying that seemed impossible from something so small. Evelyn couldn't stop to tend to him. Stopping meant cold, meant worse. She pressed her hand against him through the wrappings and said his name. She had been calling them Daniel and May in her head, though she hadn't told anyone that, and she kept walking. Rowan stopped and turned. He had heard it too. He's cold and hungry, and he doesn't understand what's happening," Evelyn said. "Neither do I, actually. Keep walking." Rowan held her eyes for a moment and then turned and kept walking. The crying went on for 20 minutes and then stopped. She didn't let herself think about why. They stopped twice before dark. Rowan built a small fire both times with what seemed like very little effort, and she was beginning to understand that he had been doing this his entire life, that the skills she'd seen in the cabin and on the trail were not impressive to him. They were just the ordinary equipment of being alive. He fed her twice more. He checked the twins with a practicality that was somehow not impersonal. He looked at each of them carefully, the way someone looks when they're actually trying to determine something and not just going through motions. "The boy," she said at the second stop. "He went quiet on the trail." "He's sleeping," Rowan said. "His color's okay. Keep him against your body." "I know to keep him against my body." "I know you do." She didn't say anything. The fire between them popped and breathed. "You've done this before," she said after a while. "Helped someone in trouble like this." "Some. Your people are far from here." "I range wide in winter, following game." He poked at the fire without looking up. "I almost didn't come up the ridge when I saw the smoke. I had a line set 2 miles south and I was behind on it." She looked at him. "Why did you?" He was quiet for longer than the question warranted. "The smoke was wrong," he said finally. "Too thin, too low. A healthy fire smokes differently." He paused. And it was the kind of day when you think about whether you want to be the person who kept walking. She didn't respond to that. There wasn't much to respond to. She thought about Daniel, who had been that kind of person, the kind who stopped. She thought about how she had loved that about him. She thought about sitting across a fire in a blizzard from a man she had known for 6 hours, who might be that same kind of person, and how the world was stranger than anything she'd imagined when she had packed her trunks in St. Louis 8 months ago. "You have family?" she asked. "My mother's people at the settlement, 2 cousins. My mother died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry." "And you had a husband?" 6 days ago." He didn't say he was sorry. He just nodded, like he was taking the fact seriously. She appreciated that more than the words would have been. "He built a table," she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. "With an uneven leg. He was going to fix it." She stopped. "I burned it." The fire shifted between them. "My mother had a bowl she'd kept since she was 12, Rowan said. "I broke it moving camp 3 winters ago. It was an accident, but it was still a broken bowl." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "That's not the same thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "But things get broken. Things get burned. That's not what they were." She thought about that for a long time. Then the boy shifted against her chest and made a small, warm, living sound, and she pressed her hand against him and felt his heart beating under her palm, small and steady and entirely real. And she looked across the fire at this stranger who had walked in out of the blizzard and made a decision she did not fully understand, and she thought, another day, make it through another day. The snow had started again. Rowan looked up at the sky with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not quite alarm, not quite resignation. Something professional and measuring. "We should move before it builds," he said. She stood. She adjusted her children against her body. She looked once at the small fire they were leaving behind, already fighting to survive. Then she followed him into the dark. The second night was worse than the first. Evelyn had not thought that was possible. The first night she had been too cold and too afraid to sleep more than 20 minutes at a stretch, jolting awake each time to check her children the way she'd been doing since they were born. Palm flat, waiting for the rise and fall. But the second night the temperature dropped to something that had no business existing in a world where living things were meant to survive, and the shelter Rowan built from packed snow and a canvas he'd folded into his pack was not warm. It was merely less deadly than the open air. And there is a significant difference between those two things that you only truly understand when you are living inside that difference. She woke sometime in the deep middle of the night to find Rowan sitting upright, not sleeping, watching the entrance of the shelter with the particular alertness of someone who has heard something. "What is it?" she said. Not a question. A statement. The way you speak when you're too tired for question marks. "Wine shifted," he said. "Go back to sleep." "You're not sleeping." "I sleep differently than you do." She looked at him in the dark. She could barely see him, just the outline of him, the stillness. "Does that mean you don't sleep, or that you sleep while appearing to be awake?" "Somewhere in between." He glanced at her. "The twins?" She checked, both breathing. The boy, Daniel, she had started calling him Daniel in her head without apologizing for it, had his face turned into the warmth of her neck. May was making small sounds that weren't quite crying, which was what May did. Already, 11 days into her life, she had opinions about things. "Fine," Evelyn said. "Both fine." Rowan nodded and went back to watching the entrance. She lay there and could not go back to sleep. Her body was past the point of normal exhaustion into something that felt structural, like the tiredness was load-bearing. But her mind wouldn't stop. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind work itself around the outside of the shelter and thought about the cabin, which was probably already colder than the outside air by now, the fire long dead, the crack in the beam letting in whatever it was letting in. She thought about the spring, which Rowan had said was when people would have found her, and she thought about what they would have found. "Why did you leave the settlement?" she said. "To range this far in winter." He was quiet for a moment. She thought he might not answer. "I go where the game goes," he said, "and I don't always want to be in the same place as everyone else." That sounds like something with a longer answer. He shifted slightly. "It usually does." She didn't push. She had learned, watching him on the trail, that he answered questions at his own pace, and that pushing produced shorter answers rather than longer ones. She filed it away the way she had been filing things away since yesterday morning. Observations about this man who held her life in his hands. Inventory of what he was. Assessments of whether her original instinct to trust him had been right. So far, the instinct seemed to be holding. My father was a surveyor, she said. She wasn't sure why she said it. White man, Ohio family, went to work for the railroad in his 20s, met my mother at a church social, and that was that. She paused. He used to say that the most important thing about any piece of land was understanding what it wanted to be. Not what you wanted it to be. What it wanted. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Smart man. He died when I was 16, surveying accident. She looked at the canvas ceiling of the shelter. I used to think that was the worst thing that would happen to me. And now I have a more complete picture. She heard something that might have been a quiet exhale from his direction. Not quite a laugh, an acknowledgement. Try to sleep, he said. Tomorrow's harder than today. She wanted to ask how that was possible. She didn't, because she believed him. I was right. Tomorrow was harder than today. The new front arrived before dawn, and it arrived the way fronts arrived in the Colorado high country in the worst winter in living memory. Without courtesy, without gradation, as a wall of wind and horizontal snow that hit the moment they were 200 yards from the shelter and reduced visibility to almost nothing. Rowan stopped moving almost immediately, turned his back to the wind, and she came up against him without thinking, instinctively, and he turned them both so he was taking the brunt of it, and she had whatever small protection his body could offer. We keep going or we stop, she said into his shoulder. We keep going. His voice was flat with concentration. Stopping now means we're in the open. We need to get to the tree line, another mile east. A mile. In this. She looked down at the bundles against her chest. Daniel and May, wrapped in everything she had, their small faces turned inward. Daniel was still, which she had learned meant sleeping rather than the other thing. May was awake. She could tell by the tension in the wrappings. All right, Evelyn said. They moved. Rowan found direction by things she couldn't identify. The angle of the wind, something about the slope of the ground, the position of a rock formation she could barely see. He moved with a certainty she found both reassuring and baffling. The snow came at them sideways, and she kept her head down and watched his footsteps and stepped in them one at a time, which was the only unit of measurement she had left. Not miles, not hours. Steps. 30 minutes in, she stumbled. It wasn't a dramatic fall. Her right foot found a drift that was softer than it looked, and she went down to one knee, twisting to protect the babies, catching herself on her free hand, snow filling her sleeve to the elbow. She was up in 2 seconds. Rowan had already turned when he heard it. She saw him assess her the way he assessed everything, quickly and completely. And he reached for her arm, and she took his hand and stood. Don't do that again, he said. Believe me, she said, and kept walking. But the stumble had shaken something loose in her. Not her composure, she was too far past composure for that. But something physical, some last reserve that had been holding the weariness at a manageable distance. The next half mile was the hardest she had ever walked. Each step required a specific decision. Left foot, right foot, don't stop. Each one felt like an argument she was winning by the smallest possible margin. She started talking, not to Rowan, to herself under her breath, and occasionally to Daniel and May. Small things, fragments, the kind of thing you say to fill the space where thought is getting unreliable. She told May about Ohio in summer, about the way the corn grew so high you could walk into a field and disappear. She told Daniel about his grandfather, the surveyor, who would have had opinions about the terrain they were crossing. She told them both that they were doing well, which was the kind of thing adults say to children who cannot yet understand it and cannot yet object. Keep talking, Rowan said from ahead of her. She hadn't realized he'd been listening. Why? I can hear you. If you stop, I know something's wrong. It was a practical answer. She appreciated that it was a practical answer. She kept talking. Oh, the tree line, when they reached it, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Not because it was beautiful, it was just trees, frost-covered pines packed close together, the kind of terrain that under normal circumstances she would have found difficult to move through. But the trees broke the wind, and the broken wind felt like stepping into summer, and she stood in the first 50 feet of that forest and breathed for the first time in an hour, and felt something in her chest unclench. Rowan got a fire going against a rock face with the wind behind them. She sat close enough to it that her coat started to steam. She fed the twins, May first, who was awake and had opinions, then Daniel, who woke when May was done, as if he'd been waiting his turn with a patience his sister clearly did not possess. Rowan sat across the fire and ate something from his pack and said nothing. "How much farther?" she said when she'd finished. "Half a day? Maybe a little more, depending on the trail." She did the math. They were going to make it. The thought arrived quietly, without fanfare, more like a calculation than a feeling. Half a day. In the trees. Out of the worst of the wind. She looked at her children, both of them now in that dense, deliberate sleep that newborns do when they have eaten, and she thought, "We are going to make it." She did not say it out loud. She didn't want to. "Tell me about the settlement," she said instead. "Who I'm going to meet." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "My mother's sister. Her name is Wren. She's the one you'll need to make a good impression on first." "Why her first?" "Because she's the one who decides." "Decides what?" "Most things." He looked at the fire. "She's not going to be happy that I brought a white woman with 2 babies into the settlement in the middle of winter. I want you to understand that going in. She's not cruel. But she'll be direct with you, and she won't pretend to feel something she doesn't feel." Evelyn thought about this. "That sounds fair," she said. He glanced up. "Most people find it uncomfortable." "Most people haven't spent the last 12 days alone in a failing cabin." She adjusted May's wrappings. "I'm past comfortable. Fair is plenty." Something moved in his expression that she was beginning to learn to read. A slight shift around the eyes, not quite a smile, but in the same neighborhood. "She's going to ask you what you can do," he said. "Not what your husband did, not where you came from. What you can do. Have an answer ready." "What I can do," Evelyn repeated. She thought about it. "I can sew. I can preserve and prepare food if I have the materials. I nursed a man with fever for 4 days. I can read and write, for whatever that's worth out here. I built 2 fires a day for 11 days with things I found in a cabin while caring for newborns." She paused. "I'm not complaining. I'm just answering the question." "Good answers," Rowan said. "Will she think so?" "I think she'll think you're useful and suspicious, and she'd rather not have you there, but she's not going to put you back in a blizzard." He met her eyes. "Which is about as good as it gets to start." "I'll take it," Evelyn said. They reached the settlement in the middle of the afternoon. She had formed a picture of what it might look like from things Rowan had said on the trail. Small, she'd understood, winter quarters rather than permanent, structures built for shelter rather than comfort. The picture was close, but not complete. What she hadn't pictured was the way it sat in the landscape, tucked into a hillside the way something natural would be, low and integrated rather than imposed. She hadn't pictured the smoke from 4 or 5 fires rising in the cold air, or the sound, voices, distant and human, the particular sound of people going about their day, that hit her like a physical thing after so long with only wind. She hadn't pictured the people who stopped to look at them as they came in. There were perhaps 30 people in the winter settlement, she guessed. She became aware of being watched, not hostilely, but with the direct and uncomplicated attention of people for whom a stranger arriving in winter is significant information. She kept her chin up. She kept her face as neutral as she could manage, which probably wasn't very neutral given that she had been crying from wind and cold for the better part of the day, and her eyes were raw. A woman came out of one of the larger structures before they had crossed the settlement. She was perhaps 55, shorter than Evelyn had expected from the weight Rowan's voice had given her, but she moved with the particular quality that some people have of occupying space in a way that makes them seem larger than they are. She looked at Rowan first and said something in a language Evelyn didn't know. Her tone was not warm. Rowan answered. His tone was even, explanation rather than apology. The woman, Wren, turned to look at Evelyn. She took in the twins against Evelyn's chest. She took in the state of her coat, the rawness of her face, the way she was standing. She said something else. Rowan turned to Evelyn. "She wants to know if the children are healthy." "They're cold and they've been traveling for 2 days, but they've eaten and they're breathing," Evelyn said. "I believe they're healthy. I'll know better when I can get them warm," he translated. Wren's eyes didn't leave Evelyn's face during the translation. Then she said something short and turned and walked back toward the structure she'd come from. "Was that yes?" Evelyn said. "That was come inside," Rowan said. "Which is yes." The inside of the structure was warm in a way that made Evelyn's eyes sting. She stood just inside the door and breathed it in. Wood smoke, food, the smell of people and animals, and daily life. And for a moment she couldn't move because the warmth and the relief and the 2 days of cold were all arriving at once, and her body didn't know what to do with any of it. Wren spoke again. A younger woman appeared from somewhere, and Wren said something to her, and the woman looked at Evelyn and gestured toward a blanket near the fire. Evelyn went. She sat. She unwrapped Daniel and May with hands that were still not fully reliable. The cold had been in her fingers so long they responded a half-beat slower than she intended, and she laid them on the blanket in the warmth and looked at them. They were fine. She could see it, the color in their faces, the way May immediately registered the warmth and started to work her fists, the way Daniel made a sound that was somewhere between irritated and satisfied. They were fine. She pressed both hands flat against her thighs and sat there and did not cry, because she had already decided she was not going to cry in front of strangers, and she held to that for approximately 45 seconds before it became impossible. She turned her face away. It didn't matter. Wren had seen it. She could tell without looking. The older woman said something, not to Evelyn, to the room in general. The younger woman brought a cup of something and set it near Evelyn's hands. Evelyn looked at it and then at Wren. "Drink it," Rowan said from somewhere behind her. "It's broth." She drank it. It was the most real thing she had tasted in 4 days. Her hands were shaking and she spilled some and she didn't care. Wren crouched down across from her, slowly, the way older people do when their joints have their own opinions, and looked at the babies. She reached out and adjusted May's wrappings with the efficiency of someone who has handled many infants. Then she looked at Evelyn. She said something. Rowan translated from the doorway. She says, "You kept them alive. That's not a small thing." Evelyn looked at Wren. "Tell her I had help," she said. Tell her your help." He translated. Wren listened, looked briefly at Rowan with an expression Evelyn couldn't parse, and then looked back at Evelyn and said something else. "She says that a woman who knows how to receive help is not foolish," Rowan said. "That's a compliment by her standard." "I'll take it," Evelyn said. Her voice came out rough. She cleared her throat. "I want her to know that I understand I'm a guest here, that I don't expect anything beyond what I can earn." She waited for the translation, watching Wren's face. The older woman listened, looked at her for a long moment with those steady, assessing eyes, and then said something that was the longest thing she'd said yet. "She says," Rowan said, and there was something careful in his voice now, something she couldn't identify, "that guests become a burden in winter when food is not plentiful. She says you may stay because you are alive and you have children, and putting you back in the snow is not something she will do. She says she will watch how you behave before she decides what to think of you." "That's fair," Evelyn said. Rowan spoke again. Wren looked at Evelyn and made a short sound that was not a laugh but was adjacent to one, and then stood up and walked away. "What did you say?" Evelyn said. "I told her you said it was fair." He came the rest of the way into the room and crouched by the fire. "She finds you interesting. That's better than she finds you inconvenient, which is what I expected." "High bar." "It's winter. The bar is survival. Everything else is extra." The days that followed were not easy and did not pretend to be. She healed slowly, in the way of people who have been reduced to almost nothing and have to rebuild from the foundation. The first 3 days she slept more than she was awake, which she hadn't done since before the twins were born, and she woke each time with a brief disorientation before she remembered where she was. The warmth of the settlement, the sounds of other people, the particular quality of the fire in this place versus the fire in the cabin. Daniel and May were tended to when she couldn't manage it, by the younger woman whose name she learned was Alara, who was perhaps 17 and had a matter-of-fact competence with infants that suggested she had been helping with younger siblings or cousins since she could walk. Evelyn watched Alara with the twins and felt something complicated, gratitude and something else, something that might have been the specific loneliness of needing help and knowing you need it. She had been so certain she could do all of it herself. She had been entirely wrong. On the 4th day, she got up and asked Wren, through Rowan when he was available and through gestures when he wasn't, what she could do. Wren looked her over with the same assessing eyes as before and put her to work mending. There was a pile of clothing that needed attention, coats, boots, coverings of various kinds. and Evelyn sat by the fire with May on her lap, and Daniel in a length of cloth someone had rigged near the warmth, and she sewed for 6 hours and did not stop except to feed them. Wren came to look at her work in the early evening. She picked up each piece and examined it without comment. She put them down and walked away. Rowan appeared in the doorway later. She said, "Your stitching is small and even," he said. "Is that approval?" From Wren, "That's a declaration of affection." He came and sat near the fire, not too close. I was around in the evenings and gone through the days. She had gathered he was still hunting, still ranging, still doing the thing he did that kept him moving at the edges. "How are you feeling?" "Better than 4 days ago." "That's not a high bar either." "No," she agreed, "but I'll take it." He was quiet for a moment, turning something over in his hands. A piece of carved wood she'd seen him working on in spare moments, some shape she hadn't identified yet. "Some of the others have been asking about you," he said. "Good questions or bad questions?" "Cautious questions. There's a man named Cutter, my mother's cousin, about 40, who thinks I made a mistake bringing you here. He hasn't said it to your face, but he's said it to other faces." He glanced up. "I want you to know that before you hear it some other way." She looked at the fire. "What does he think I'm going to do?" "He thinks you're going to make things harder, that soldiers who see a white woman in the settlement will ask questions the settlement doesn't want to answer." She thought about that. "Is he wrong?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "He's not entirely wrong," he said. "It's a real risk. I knew it when I brought you in. I decided you dying in a cabin with your children was a worse outcome. That's a fairly personal decision to make for 30 people." "Yes," he said. He said it plainly, without deflecting. "It was. I'd make the same one again." She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. "Why?" she said. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was even, but there was something underneath it. "Because my mother died alone," he said. "Fever, 4 years ago, while I was ranging. By the time I got back, it was over." He paused. "I know what it looks like when someone has run out of road. I wasn't going to walk past that twice." The fire shifted. Somewhere across the settlement, someone was singing something low and quiet. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said, "about your mother." "I know you are." They sat there for a while after that without speaking, and it was not uncomfortable. The weeks passed the way winter weeks do in settlements, slowly and then in chunks, time bending under the weight of routine. Evelyn learned the rhythms of the place, who rose first, who made decisions, which disputes went to Wren and which resolved themselves. She learned a few words of the language, badly at first, then less badly, the way you learn things when you're surrounded by them and motivated by the specific desire not to be a burden. Cutter watched her. She felt it, not threatening, but measuring, the way you watch something you're not sure about. She was careful around him, not submissive, but careful. She did her work without complaining. She did not ask for more than she needed. When there was extra labor, hauling snow for water, gathering pine for the fire, she appeared without being asked, which she had learned was the specific currency of belonging in a working settlement. May was thriving. That was clear within 2 weeks. She was eating well, gaining the weight she should have been gaining, making the sounds that Alara assured her were correct sounds for a healthy baby. Daniel was slower. He had been the quieter one since the night on the trail when the crying had stopped, and he remained quieter, a little less emphatic than his sister, but he was growing, and his color was good, and the hollow terror she'd felt on that trail watching him go silent had loosened its grip with each passing day. She named them formally in the 4th week. Daniel and May Harper, spoken aloud to Wren and Alara and Rowan and anyone else who happened to be nearby. Wren listened to the names with that measuring expression and then said something. Rowan translated. "She says those are good names. She says Daniel means something about strength in your language." "I'm not sure that's exactly right," Evelyn said, "but I'll take it." The older woman's mouth did the thing again, that almost not quite. It was the middle of the 5th week when Cutter finally spoke to her directly. He came to where she was working, still mending, always mending. The settlement seemed to generate an inexhaustible supply of things that needed stitching, and he crouched down across from her the way Wren had that first night, but with a different quality, the weight of a man who has something to say that he's been not saying for a while. "You plan to stay past winter," he said. Not a question. "I don't know yet." Evelyn said. She kept her hands moving. I haven't decided. Your kind of people have a settlement 30 miles east. I know where the trading post is. There are people there who will help a widow with children. It's what they do. She looked up from her work. Are you asking me to leave? He met her eyes. He had the same quality Wren had, that willingness to hold a look without shifting. I'm asking what you intend, he said, because intending to leave is different from intending to stay, and both of them are different from not knowing. I can work with the first two. She set the mending in her lap. She thought about what she intended. She'd been not thinking about it carefully, filling her days with the work of staying useful, and maybe that had been its own kind of answer. I don't know if I have somewhere to go back to, she said. The cabin is there, but it may not be standing. The people at the trading post, I don't know them well enough to know what they'd give me and what they'd expect in return. She looked at him steadily. What I know is that the people here kept my children alive when I couldn't. That's not something I'll forget or treat as nothing. He looked at her for a long moment. That's honest, he said. Rowan told me honest is the thing to be around here. Something moved in his face, brief, but there. He's not wrong about everything, Cutter said. He stood up. He didn't say anything else. He walked away. She went back to her mending. Alara appeared a few minutes later, pointedly not looking at her, and sat down nearby with her own work. He talked to you, Alara said. Her English was accented but good, better than Evelyn had realized. Yes. That's better than if he hadn't. When Cutter doesn't talk to you, that's when you have a problem. Evelyn looked at her. How old are you? 17. You speak English very well. My father traded at the Eastern Post for years. I grew up with it. She glanced over. Your accent is Ohio. Evelyn blinked. How do you know Ohio? I've met 3 Ohio women in my life, and they all sound exactly like you. She said it with a certainty that was somehow both young and not young at all. Evelyn looked at this girl, this 17-year-old who had tended her children and helped her without being asked, and apparently cataloged regional accents as a hobby, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, something that was not dread or desperation or grief. Something lighter. Not happiness, exactly. Something earlier than happiness. Something that was more like the precondition for it. Thank you, Evelyn said, for the help with Daniel and May. They're good babies, Alara said, like it was a simple fact. May has ideas. Daniel will be the patient one. She paused. I don't always know which is harder to be. Probably depends on the day, Evelyn said. Alara considered this. Yes, she said. Probably. Outside, the wind moved through the settlement. Inside, the fire burned steady and warm. Somewhere across the room, May made the sound she made when she was about to insist on something, and Daniel, as if in response, made a sound that was quieter and seemed to say, I know, I can wait. Spring came to the Colorado high country the way it always did, not as an arrival, but as an argument. 3 warm days followed by a hard frost, followed by mud, followed by snow. Again, the season refusing to commit until sometime in late April, when the land finally conceded and the melt began in earnest. Evelyn noticed it first in the light. The quality of it changed before the temperature did, something longer and more horizontal in the mornings. The way it came through the gaps in the settlement's eastern wall and lay across the floor in actual warmth rather than just brightness. She noticed it in Daniel and May, too, who were 3 months old now and had opinions about light, about sound, about each other. May had discovered that her brother was a separate person and found this information both interesting and personally inconvenient. Daniel had discovered that if he waited long enough, May would exhaust herself and he could have the quiet he seemed to prefer. She noticed the spring in herself last. The thing that lifted, slowly, incompletely, like something waterlogged finally drying out, was not the grief, which remained, but the specific weight of survival mode thinking that had sat on top of everything else since November. She started to have thoughts that were not about the next 4 hours. She started to notice things that weren't threats or resources. Small things, the particular sound of the settlement in the morning before full waking, the way Alara talked to the babies in her own language as though they already understood it, which maybe they did. She was mending near the fire on one of the first genuinely warm afternoons when Wren sat down across from her without preamble and said, in English, "What will you do when winter is finished?" Evelyn looked up. In 4 months of living in the same settlement, she had not heard Wren speak English before. She hadn't known Wren spoke it. She set the mending in her lap. "I didn't know you had English," she said. "I have enough English," Wren said. "What will you do?" Evelyn thought about the cabin 30 miles west. She had thought about it in pieces throughout the winter, not missing it exactly, but aware of it, the way you're aware of something you left behind that may or may not still be there. "I need to go back and look at what's left," she said. "The land is mine. The homestead claim is filed. Daniel, my husband, he filed before we arrived. And if the cabin stands, then I rebuild what needs rebuilding and start the season." She looked at Wren steadily. "And I come back here when I can, if that's permitted." Wren was quiet for a moment. She looked at the babies, May on her back on the blanket, studying her own fist with deep concentration, Daniel asleep in the cloth sling nearby. Then she looked back at Evelyn. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would need more. Someone who would take without seeing she was taking." She said it without apology, like a factual report. "You see when you are taking, you pay back in the same measure. That is not common." Evelyn thought about what to say to that. "You didn't make it easy to do otherwise," she said. Wren's mouth did the thing. "No," she agreed. "I did not." That was the closest they had come to something like friendship, and they both seemed to understand that it was close enough. Rowan came back from a 4-day ranging trip on the first Thursday of April and knew before he'd been in the settlement an hour that something had shifted. It was not one thing. It was the combination of the longer light and the mud underfoot, and the way conversations were happening that were not winter conversations. People making plans, looking east and west rather than straight down at the ground in front of them. He found Evelyn at the settlement's eastern edge, where she had taken to walking with the twins in the later afternoon. She was carrying both of them, one on each side, which she had learned to do over the winter with the efficiency of someone who has run out of other options and discovered capability she hadn't known was there. "You're back," she said. "I am." He fell into step beside her. He had learned over the winter that she walked when she was thinking, and that the walking was not an invitation for interruption, but was also not a closed door. "Anything?" she said. "East of the ridge there are new survey markers." He said it carefully, the way he'd learned to say things to her. Direct, not softened, because she didn't want softening and he didn't like providing it. 3 of them, maybe 4 miles apart. Fresh wood. Army grade. She stopped walking. "How far from here?" 12 miles, as of this week. Could be 8 miles by summer, the way they're moving. She turned to look at him. Daniel made a sound at the movement. He registered her mood changes before she'd fully had them, which had started happening around 6 weeks and still surprised her. "What does that mean for the settlement?" "It means the question we've been not asking is becoming the question we have to ask." He looked east, though there was nothing to see from where they stood. "Whether we move again, further west, further north, or whether we find a way to be visible and documented in a way that makes moving us more complicated than it's worth. Can you do that? Document a claim?" "That's what I need to talk to my mother's cousin about." He meant Wren, not Cutter, though Cutter would have to be part of it. "And there are people at the trading post east, settlers who've been here longer than the Army's interest, who might be willing to put something in writing." "I can help with that," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Writing," she said. "The legal kind. My father worked with surveyors. I grew up understanding how land documentation works. I know what it needs to say to have weight." She shifted May, who was beginning to express dissatisfaction with the current arrangement. "And I'm a white woman with a filed homestead claim. That counts for something with the kind of men who read those documents." He was quiet for a moment. "It does," he said. He said it without the bitterness that would have been easy to carry, and she understood that the absence of bitterness was its own kind of statement. "I know it shouldn't matter," she said. "A lot of things shouldn't matter," he said. "That doesn't change what they do." She nodded. They walked back toward the settlement in the afternoon light, which was doing the thing spring light does when it's finally meaning it, long and warm and almost persuasive. She had been back at the cabin for 6 days when the rancher arrived. She had not expected the cabin to be standing. It was standing. The crack in the beam had opened another inch. She could see sky through it in one spot. But the structure had held, which said something about how Daniel had built it, which made the fact of it harder to look at. She had spent the first day simply making it functional, clearing the worst of the damage, getting the fire going properly, assessing what had survived the winter and what hadn't. What had survived? Most of the tools, the iron stove, the trunk with her winter clothing, the filing documents for the homestead claim which she had wrapped in oilcloth last fall on an instinct she was now grateful for. What hadn't? The food stores, some of the roof boards on the north side, the second chair. The table with the uneven leg was ash because she had burned it, and she found the space where it had stood more jarring than she expected. She was on the roof on the 6th day, replacing the damaged boards with lumber she'd salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding 50 yards away, when she heard the horse. She came down from the roof. The man riding toward her was perhaps 55, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular look of someone who had been prosperous for a long time and wore it without thinking about it. He was alone. He pulled up at a distance that was respectful. She registered that and took off his hat. "Mrs. Harper," he said. She didn't recognize him. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "Name is Caldwell. Emmett Caldwell. I run the Box C, about 14 miles south." He glanced at the cabin, at the roof work she'd been doing, at the twins in their setup near the door, May awake, and watching him with the focused attention she gave everything new, Daniel asleep regardless. "I heard about your husband. I'm sorry for it." "Thank you," she said. She kept her voice level. "What brings you 14 miles north, Mr. Caldwell?" He turned his hat in his hands, a gesture she had seen men make when they had something to say that they weren't sure how to start. "I was a friend to your husband. We met at the trading post last September. He was a good man and he talked about you with considerable pride, ma'am, which I mention only because it's true and because I want you to know I'm here in that spirit." She waited. "I understand you spent the winter somewhere," he said. "I'm not going to ask where because I think it's your business. But I want you to know that my wife and I have a proper house, and we have a spare room, and if you wanted to bring those children somewhere with walls that don't need work, and people who can help you." He stopped. "I'm not trying to overstep." "You're not," she said. "It's a kind offer." He nodded. "There's also the matter of the land." He said it carefully, the way people say things they've been rehearsing. "The homestead claim your husband filed. The acreage is good land, and I know there are people who'd be interested in acquiring it if you were of a mind to sell and start somewhere easier. I'm not one of those people. I want to be plain about that. I'm not here to buy. But I'm telling you the offer exists because you should know what your options are." She looked at him. He was telling the truth, she thought, or enough of it. He wasn't here to buy her out. I was here because a man he'd liked had died, and the man's wife had apparently survived the winter somewhere impossible, and he felt responsible in the diffuse way people feel responsible for things they had nothing to do with. "Can I ask you something, Mr. Caldwell?" "Of course." "Do you know what the survey markers east of the ridge mean? The new ones?" He was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, but a kind of wariness. "I know they're there," he said. "There's talk of a resettlement push. Army clearing the high country, moving native families further west." He held her eyes. "It's not something I have a hand in. I want to be clear about that. But you know it's coming." "I know it's being talked about," he said. "Whether it comes and when and how hard, that I don't know." She nodded. She turned and looked at her cabin, at the roof board she'd been fitting into place when he arrived, at the filing documents sitting in their oilcloth wrap on the table inside, the new table, the one she'd pulled together from the salvaged lumber because the space where Daniel's table had been was too empty. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee if you'll give me a minute." He got down from his horse. Caldwell stayed 2 hours. They talked the way people talk when they are finding the edges of each other, what they have in common, what they don't, where the gaps are. He was not a bad man. She had been trying to determine that carefully throughout the visit, because she had learned in the past 4 months that determining what kind of man you were dealing with was primary information, the kind that changed everything else. He told her about the territory, about what had changed in the 8 months since she and Daniel had arrived. New settlers coming faster than infrastructure could support them. Land disputes. Army presence increasing, which he said like a man who had complicated feelings about it, that he wasn't going to share with someone he'd just met. She told him she was staying. She told him the homestead was not for sale, and she was not coming to stay in his spare room, which she thanked him for sincerely. She told him she had resources and intended to work the land through spring and summer and had plans for the property that were her own business for now. He looked at her the way people look when they're recalibrating. "You're more settled than I expected," he said. "I've had a hard winter," she said. "Hard winters settle a person." "Where did you spend it?" She had known he'd come back to that. "With people who helped me," she said. "I owe them more than I can properly say." He was quiet for a moment. He was not a stupid man. She could see him assembling the available information and arriving at a conclusion he had the discretion not to speak aloud. "The survey push," he said after a moment. "If it comes hard and fast, there are folks east who wouldn't welcome it. Older settlers, people who've built trading relationships that would be disrupted." He looked at her steadily. "I'm one of them. I'm not alone." "That's useful to know," Evelyn said. "I thought it might be." He stood up and picked up his hat. "I'll come back in a month. I'm agreeable," she said. "And Mr. Caldwell, if you're willing to put something in writing about the trading relationships you mentioned, with your name on it, that's more useful than most things I could think of." He looked at her for a moment. "Your husband said you were smart," he said. "He was right about that too." She walked him to his horse. She watched him ride south and stood there in the spring afternoon with the twins behind her and the repaired roof above her and the filing documents inside. And she thought about Rowan at the settlement 12 miles away, having a conversation with Wren about survey markers and documentation. And she thought about how the same problem looked different depending on which direction you were standing. She went back inside and started writing. She rode back to the settlement 4 days later. It was her second time making the journey without Rowan, and it was different from the first. Not easier exactly, but known. She knew the terrain now. She knew where the drifts would still be deep in the shaded cuts and where the ground would be reliable. She had borrowed a horse from a neighbor 2 miles east, a woman named Pratt, who had asked no questions and lent it without ceremony, which was the kind of neighbor worth having. And she rode with Daniel and May in the configuration she'd worked out over the previous months, the twins against her in wrappings she could adjust from the saddle. She arrived mid-afternoon to find the settlement in the middle of something. Not a crisis, not yet, but the particular energy of people in urgent conversation, the kind where voices are low and frequent and the work of the day has paused. Rowan came to meet her before she was fully off the horse. That alone told her something. "What happened?" she said. "A patrol came through this morning," he said. 4 soldiers, officer in front. They were counting. He said the last word with a flatness that conveyed everything it needed to. "How many structures? How many people? How many horses?" "Did they speak to anyone?" "Wren." The officer asked how long the settlement had been here and whether it was permanent or seasonal. She told him it was her family's winter ground and had been for longer than any record he was likely to find. He paused. "He wrote something down and left." "Did he threaten anything?" "No, he was polite." He said polite the same way he'd said counting, a word carrying more weight than its surface. Polite and counting. She reached into the bag at her side and pulled out the papers she'd spent 3 nights writing. "I have something," she said. He looked at the papers and then at her face. "Caldwell, the rancher who came by the cabin. He's willing to sign a statement about established trading relationships in the territory. I've drafted it." She handed him the pages. "There are 3 other things here. One is a copy of my homestead filing with a note that the Harper claim borders the settlement's winter ground on the eastern side, which creates a documented relationship between the two. One is a list of everything the settlement provided me over the winter, which I've framed as a formal record of assistance and community cooperation. And one is a draft letter addressed to the territorial office, making the case that this settlement represents a stable, documented community with established ties to the homesteading population." He was reading while she talked. He read carefully, the way she had learned he did everything, fully, without rushing. "This is good," he said. "It's a start. Caldwell said he knows other settlers who wouldn't welcome disruption to the trading relationships. We need their names on paper, and we need someone at the territorial office who will actually read what we send." She paused. "Do you know anyone there?" "No." He looked up. "But Cutter's brother-in-law traded legally with a post agent for 6 years before he died. There may be a record of that which matters. Then we need to find it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite surprised, Mum. He wasn't easily surprised. Something more like reassessment. You did all this in 4 days. I had 3 nights, she said. I work better when I have a problem. I know, he said. I'm not criticizing it. Good, she said. Because I also told Caldwell he should come back in a month, and I may have implied he'd be meeting with people who had an interest in the territory's stability. I should have asked first. I'm asking now. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of meeting? The kind where we show him that the settlement is not a threat to his operation and might in fact be useful to it. The kind where we make it harder for the army to frame the removal as unopposed. He looked east, the way he'd looked east when he told her about the survey markers. Then he folded the papers carefully and looked back at her. I'll talk to Wren, he said. I'll come with you, Evelyn said. What? Wren read every page. She read them in the way she did everything, completely and without comment until she was ready to comment, which was not a quality Evelyn had found comfortable at first and had come to find trustworthy. When she finished, she set the papers on her knee and looked at Evelyn. You are making us visible, she said, in English, as she had taken to doing when it was just the 3 of them. Yes, Evelyn said, on purpose. Being visible has cost us before. I know it has. I'm not telling you it's without risk. She held Wren's eyes. I'm telling you that not being visible hasn't protected you either. They came this morning with a man writing things down. He's already making a record. The question is whether our record or his record has more weight when someone in an office decides what to do. Wren looked at Rowan. Rowan said something in their language, short, even, the way he spoke when he was giving an opinion rather than arguing one. Wren was quiet for a long time. She looked out through the entrance of the structure at the settlement in the spring afternoon. People moving, the daily work going on, the particular quality of a community that has survived another winter and is tentatively extending itself toward the warmth. The rancher, she said. Caldwell. What kind of man is he? Careful, Evelyn said. Practical. He knew Daniel, and it meant something to him. He's not the kind of man who does things from principle. He does them because they serve his interests, and right now his interests and ours are pointed the same direction. That lasts only as long as they point the same direction. I know, that's why we build the paper record while they do. She paused. I'm not asking you to trust him. I'm asking you to let me manage the relationship while it's useful, and to know that I'll tell you when it stops being useful. Wren looked at her with those measuring eyes. And if I say no, then I don't bring him here. But I think we'll regret it. The older woman was quiet. Outside, May's voice rose briefly in the settlement and then settled. Alara had her, Evelyn knew. Daniel was quiet, which meant either asleep or content, which had lately become the same thing. You understand, Wren said slowly, that some of the people here will not want this, that Cutter will have things to say. Cutter will always have things to say, Evelyn said, and then caught herself because that was perhaps too blunt for the conversation. But Wren's mouth did the thing, the almost, the adjacent, and Evelyn realized that Wren found her bluntness about Cutter privately satisfying in a way she would never admit. He is not wrong to be careful, Wren said. No, he's right to be careful. Careful is different from stopped. Wren looked at the papers one more time. She ran her thumb across the edge of the page, feeling the texture of it, Evelyn thought, the reality of the object. Then she nodded once, the way she communicated decisions, without ceremony, without waiting for acknowledgement. The meeting, she said. Here, not at his ranch. Here, Evelyn agreed. And you speak, not as translator. You speak as part of this settlement. Evelyn paused. Are you saying I'm part of this settlement? Wren stood up with the careful deliberateness of her joints and handed the papers back to Rowan. I'm saying, she said, that you spent a winter here and earned your way through it, and your children know the sound of this fire and the smell of this wood. I'm saying what that means. She walked out. Rowan looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at the door Wren had walked through. That's as direct as she gets, he said. I know, Evelyn said. Her throat had done something unexpected. She ignored it. We need to write to the territorial office before Caldwell comes. I want the letter sent before the meeting so we can tell him it's already filed. I'll get paper, Rowan said. I already have paper, Evelyn said. I brought extra. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been learning to read all winter, the one that wasn't quite a smile. Of course you did, he said. She sat down at the low table near the fire and spread out a clean sheet and dipped the pen she'd brought from the cabin and began to write the kind of letter that had to be exactly right, measured and plain and impossible to dismiss. Outside the settlement moved in its spring rhythms. The longer light, the mud underfoot, the sound of a community tentatively opening itself to the season ahead. Inside the fire burned and she wrote and the words came steadily, because the words were right there, because she had been composing them in her head for 4 days, because she was the kind of woman, she had learned, who worked better when she had a problem. And the problem, she understood now with a clarity that had not been available to her in November, was not going to solve itself. Caldwell came on a Thursday in early May, which was not the Thursday they'd agreed on but the one before it, and he didn't come alone. Evelyn saw the horses from the roof of the cabin, where she had been finishing the last of the board work. 2 riders, Caldwell in front, a man she didn't know behind him. She came down the ladder with a controlled speed that was not quite hurrying and got to the ground and assessed the second man while Caldwell was still pulling up. He was younger than Caldwell by 15 years, lean in the way of men who work outside, with a quality about him that she placed after a moment as legal, something in how he held himself, contained and observing. He had a satchel across his saddle that looked like it held documents. "Mrs. Harper," Caldwell said, taking off his hat. "I know I'm early. I apologize for that. Something came up that I thought you'd want to know about before the meeting." "Get down then," she said. "Both of you." The second man introduced himself as Harlan Pruitt. He was a land agent out of Denver, he said, which was a title that covered a range of things on the frontier, some of them useful and some of them not. He said it without apparent awareness that she would need to determine which kind he was, which either meant he was confident or oblivious. She reserved judgment. Inside, with coffee she'd made that morning and kept warm, Caldwell got to the point. "There was an incident 4 days ago," he said, "at the Morrow Creek crossing, about 6 miles northeast of your property line. 2 settlers from the Eastern group, men I don't know well, but I know their names, had a confrontation with a hunting party." He paused. "Native hunters, coming back through their usual route." Evelyn set her cup down. "What kind of confrontation?" "The kind that ends with a man hurt and a story that's going to get told in 2 very different ways depending on who's telling it." He looked at her steadily. "One of the hunters was struck. Not killed, but struck and his horse taken. The settlers claimed the hunting party crossed their marked land. The hunting party's route hasn't changed in 30 years. Was anyone from the settlement involved? Rowan's people? I don't know. That's partly why I came early." He glanced at Pruitt. "Harlan has connections with the territorial office. When the Army hears about an incident like this, it accelerates conversations they were already having." Pruitt opened his satchel. "There's a preliminary removal order being drafted," he said, "for the high country settlements. It's not signed yet. It may not be signed for weeks, but the Morrow Creek incident is the kind of thing that gives it momentum." He set a document on the table. Evelyn looked at it without touching it. It was a copy. She could tell by the handwriting, which was careful in the way of someone copying rather than composing, and it had the particular language of official documents that she recognized from her father's work. Passive constructions, euphemisms, the bureaucratic architecture of decisions that had already been made dressed up as proposals still under consideration. "Where did you get this?" she said. Pruitt met her eyes. "I have a colleague in the office. He shares things when he thinks they matter." "Why does he think they matter?" "Because he grew up on a homestead, and he's not entirely comfortable with what he's being asked to draft." He paused. "He's not going to act against his employer, but he'll share a copy with a land agent who happens to be traveling through the territory." She looked at the document again, then she looked at Caldwell. "You knew about this before you came." "I found out yesterday," he said. "I came as soon as I could." She stood up and went to the window. The horses were tied outside, switching their tails in the spring warmth. Daniel was asleep in the crib she'd reconstructed from salvaged wood. May was awake in the carry cloth across Evelyn's front, which was where May was most of the day because May had recently decided that being set down was a personal offense. "The meeting at the settlement," she said. "It needs to happen sooner, today, if you're willing." Caldwell and Pruitt exchanged a look. I brought Harlan because I thought his connections might be useful, Caldwell said. That's what I can offer. What he can offer, Evelyn said, turning back from the window, is his name. On the letter we've already drafted, and any names he can bring from the territorial office who are not entirely comfortable. She looked at Pruitt directly. Can you do that? Pruitt considered her for a moment with those assessing eyes. I can put my name on a letter that documents existing land use and trading relationships, he said. That's within what a land agent legitimately does. I can't represent that I'm acting against the office. I'm not asking you to act against anyone. I'm asking you to document what exists. She pulled the papers she'd been working on from the shelf where she kept them. The letter to the territorial office, Caldwell's drafted statement, the settlement record she'd compiled. She spread them on the table. Read these. Tell me what makes them stronger. Pruitt read. Caldwell read over his shoulder, which he'd clearly already done once, but read again. Evelyn moved around the table and fed May, who accepted this as the minimum acceptable response to her dissatisfaction. The homestead adjacency argument is good, Pruitt said after a while. The established trading record needs a date range. You have activities listed but no timeline, and the office needs a timeline. He looked up. And you need a signature from someone who has dealt with the settlement directly in a commercial capacity. Not just a statement of relationship, an actual transaction record. Cutter's brother-in-law, Evelyn said. She was thinking of what Rowan had told her in April. There may be a trade record from the Eastern Post. If it exists and it's dated, that's significant. Pruitt set the papers down. Mrs. Harper, who drafted these? I did. He looked at her for a moment. Your husband was a lucky man, he said, and she could tell he meant it practically rather than personally, and she took it in that spirit. He was, she said. Let's go. The ride to the settlement took longer with Caldwell and Pruitt than it had taken alone, partly because she had to be sure of what she was bringing before she brought it. She rode ahead and let them follow, which established from the beginning whose territory this was and under whose introduction they were arriving. Rowan was at the settlement's edge when they came in, which told her someone had seen them coming and word had moved faster than horses. He looked at the two men behind her with the expression he used when he was taking inventory, quick, complete, without showing his conclusions. The incident at Morrow Creek, she said, before he could ask. You've heard? This morning. His voice was flat. Silas, one of the hunters. His shoulder. He'll be all right. Was he one of yours? Distantly. He's from the Cutter family's network, further north. He looked at Caldwell. This is the rancher. Emmett Caldwell, Caldwell said, and had the sense to stay on his horse until someone indicated otherwise. I want to be plain about where I stand. I'm here because what happens to this settlement affects the stability of the whole territory, and I've got 14 years in this country, and I'd like 14 more without the Army remaking the map every season. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. Get down, he said. They went to Wren. She was already seated when they came in, which meant she'd known they were coming and had decided how she wanted to receive them. She had Cutter on her left, which was deliberate. Cutter's presence was a message to Evelyn that his concerns were going to be in the room, not waiting outside. Alara was in the corner with both twins, which Evelyn had not arranged but appreciated because Daniel and May in the room made the argument without anyone having to make it. Evelyn introduced Caldwell and Pruitt in plain language, who they were, what they could offer, what she'd asked them for. She did not soften Pruitt's connection to the territorial office, because Wren would read through softening and it would cost them. She laid the document Pruitt had brought on the floor. She did not put it in Wren's hands. She set it where Wren could reach for it or not, and she said what it was and where it came from. Wren looked at the document on the floor. She looked at Cutter. He looked at the document too, and then at Caldwell, and then at Evelyn with an expression that was not hostile but was not welcoming either. The expression of a man who is being asked to accept that someone he has distrusted was right about something. Then he looked at Rowan and said something in their language. Rowan answered, short, direct. Cutter looked back at the document and picked it up. While he read, Caldwell did something Evelyn had not expected. He stayed quiet. She had prepared herself to manage him, to redirect him if he said something that landed wrong, but he seemed to understand intuitively that this was not a room where talking first was the right move, and he sat across from Wren with his hat in his lap and waited. Pruitt said, in a voice that was quieter than he'd used at the cabin, "There's a trade record in the Eastern Post's ledger. Cutter family name 1871 through 1876. I confirmed it this morning before we rode out." He looked at Wren. "That's 5 years of documented commercial activity with the licensed post. It's the kind of evidence that a removal order has to address if it's going to stand up to any scrutiny." Wren looked at Pruitt. "And if they don't care about scrutiny?" Pruitt was quiet for a moment. "Then it slows them down," he said. "I won't tell you it stops them. Slowing down is what we can promise." "He's honest," Evelyn said to Wren. "I checked." Wren looked at her with something that might have been amusement if it had been anyone else. "How did you check?" "I asked him questions he couldn't have prepared for and watched whether his answers changed or stayed the same." She paused. "They stayed the same." Cutter set down the document. He said something to Wren. Longer this time, less clipped. Evelyn caught the shape of it without the words. A man revising. Not reversing. Cutter was not the reversing kind, but revising, which was harder in some ways and more reliable. Wren spoke. Rowan translated, not for Evelyn, but for Caldwell and Pruitt. She says, "We have survived by moving when staying became too costly. She says she is old enough to know that moving again takes something that doesn't grow back. She says she wants to see the letters before they are sent, and she wants her name on none of them, because her name on a document that goes to the territorial office is a liability, not an asset. She says if this woman," he glanced at Evelyn, "wants to put her own name on these papers, that is her business and her risk." Evelyn said, without hesitating, "My name goes on everything." Rowan looked at her. So did Cutter. "The Harper homestead claim borders your winter ground on the east," she said. "My name connects the settlement to a filed legal claim. That's the whole point. If there's risk in that, I'm the right person to carry it." Wren was watching her. Then she said something directly to Evelyn in English, which she had been doing more frequently since April. "Your husband is 6 months in the ground and you have 2 children under 1 year. You understand what you are taking on." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Why?" It was the same question Rowan had implicitly answered about himself on the trail. Why do you stop? Why do you take on the weight of strangers? And she had been thinking about it, in the background, for months. "Because my children are going to grow up in this territory," she said, "and I want them to grow up somewhere that didn't get built on the wrong kind of decision." The room was quiet. Outside, Mace made a sound. Alara said something soft to her, and she subsided. Wren nodded once, the way she always nodded, without ceremony. The letters went out the following week. 5 of them, addressed to different offices, carrying different emphases. The trading record, the homestead adjacency, the petition for recognition of established use, the letter from Caldwell, and 3 other ranchers whose names Pruitt had gathered in the days between the meeting and the sending. Evelyn had written or co-written all of them, and she had read each one 3 times before sealing it, looking for the places where the language could be used against them, tightening what she could. It was the most sustained work she had done since Ohio, since the years she'd spent helping her father organize survey documentation, and it felt like finding a tool she hadn't known she'd put down. The weeks that followed were not resolved. She had not expected them to be. The Army patrol came through again. Different officer, same polite counting. And she rode out to meet them on the trail that passed nearest her homestead, which meant they encountered a white woman on a documented land claim before they encountered anything else. She was courteous. She was informative. She mentioned, in passing, the letters that had been filed, the trading records, the petition, the names on it. The officer wrote things down. She watched him write and made sure her own expression told him nothing except that she was a homesteader with children and a filed claim and an interest in the territory's stability. He left without incident. She rode back to the settlement and told Rowan and Wren what had been said, and the 3 of them sat with it the way you sit with news that is neither good nor bad, but is movement, which after weeks of waiting felt like its own form of progress. It was in June that the trouble came from the other direction. She had not fully accounted for the settlers. Not Caldwell's kind, the established ones with long roots and practical orientations. The newer ones who had arrived in spring with the particular confidence of people who hadn't yet had a hard winter. 3 families had come in May and settled the land east of the Morrow Creek crossing, and they had the look of people who had been told the territory was being organized for them, which was not entirely wrong. She heard about it first from the woman Pratt, who had lent her the horse in April. Pratt rode to the cabin on a Tuesday morning with the expression of someone delivering information they're not sure how to phrase. "There's talk," she said, sitting at Evelyn's table with her hat still on, "at the Eastern Settlement, about the arrangement you have with the native group to the west." "What kind of talk?" "The kind that wonders whose side you're on." Pratt looked at her steadily. She was a direct woman, 50s, had been in the territory 9 years, and had clearly decided that directness was what the territory called for. "There are people saying you've gone native, for lack of a more polite phrase, that you're using your homestead claim to shield a group that the army should be clearing." Evelyn sat back. She had expected something like this. She had thought it would come later, that she'd have more time. "What do you think?" she said. Pratt looked at her for a moment. "I think you spent a winter somewhere and came out of it alive when you shouldn't have," she said. "And I think whatever arrangement you've made is the reason, and I think it's your business." She paused. "But I think you should know that 3 families east of the creek have been talking to the patrol officer, not the polite one. There's a second patrol now, different officer, and he's less interested in writing things down and more interested in coming to conclusions." Evelyn said, "What's his name?" "Garrett, Lieutenant Garrett." Pratt said it with a flatness that said she'd encountered him and had formed opinions. "Young, ambitious, the kind that wants a clean outcome." That night, Evelyn rode to the settlement and told Rowan. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything, and when she was done, he was quiet for a long moment. "I know the name," he said. "He came through the northern area 2 springs ago. He's not violent. I want to be clear about that. He's not the kind that starts something, but he writes reports that lead to other people starting something." "Then we need to be in his report correctly," Evelyn said, "before someone else puts us in it wrong." "How do you propose to do that?" She had been thinking about it since Pratt left. "I request a meeting with him, directly. At my homestead, not at the settlement. I present the letters we've filed, the trading record, Caldwell's statement. I show him a woman with a legal claim and documented neighbors and an interest in order." She paused. "And I make sure he understands that disrupting the current arrangement would create the disorder he's supposed to be preventing. And if he doesn't care about disorder, then I write to the men above him and make sure they know his name is attached to any disruption. Ambitious men don't like their names attached to disorder either." Rowan looked at her. "You know how to do this," he said. "This is not something you figured out this spring." "My father worked with surveyors and land agents for 20 years, she said. "I watched a lot of meetings. I learned what they were really about." "What are they really about?" "Who has the longest documented record, and who can make a problem for the person on the other side?" She said it without satisfaction. It was a fact, not something to be pleased about. "It's not right, but it's what we have." He looked at the fire. She had learned to read his silences. This one was not agreement and not disagreement, but the particular quiet of a man who understands that the tools available are not the tools he would have chosen and is deciding whether to use them anyway. "Cutter is going to say something about this," he said. "Cutter is going to say something about everything," she said. "What will he say specifically?" "That we're becoming dependent on your name. That if you leave, or if something happens to you, the papers don't have the same weight." She had thought about this too. "He's right," she said. "Which is why we need more names. Caldwell, Pratt. I'll ask Pratt if she'll sign something. The more signatures on the trading and stability record, the less dependent the whole thing is on any one person. Including you. Especially me." She looked at him directly. "I'm not trying to make myself necessary, Rowan. I'm trying to build something that doesn't need me to be necessary." He looked back. He had a way, when something landed right, of simply receiving it. No acknowledgement, no performance of being convinced. Just a settling. She saw that now. "I'll talk to Cutter," he said. "I'll request the meeting with Garrett," she said. "Tomorrow." The meeting with Garrett happened on a Friday at the cabin, which was where she'd requested it and where he agreed to come, which was already an advantage she'd been counting on. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-20s, the kind of young that had just enough authority to be dangerous. And he had the particular quality of a man who had been told he was doing important work and had believed it a little too thoroughly. He looked at the cabin, at the repaired roof, at the twins in the setup near the door. He had not expected twins. She had counted on that too. They sat at the table. She had the documents laid out before he arrived, not spread in a way that looked confrontational, but visible, present, the material reality of a documented situation. She gave him coffee. She let him look around. "I understand you're concerned about the arrangement between my property and the settlement to the west," she said, when he'd settled. He looked at her carefully. "I'm concerned about clarity," he said, "about who is using what land for what purpose, and whether existing arrangements are consistent with the territory's direction." "Then let me give you clarity," she said. "I have a filed homestead claim, dated September of last year, which borders the settlement's winter ground on the east." She pointed to the relevant document. "The settlement has a 5-year trade record with the Eastern Post, which I have here in copy." She pointed to that. "I spent the winter in the settlement after my husband died, and I was unable to survive alone with 2 newborn children. The settlement kept my children alive. I've documented that arrangement here as a formal record of community assistance." She let him look at each page. "All of this has been submitted to the territorial office in Denver and to the land agent registry." She paused. "I imagine the names on those submissions are familiar to you." He looked at Caldwell's name. She watched him recognize it and file it. "The concern," he said more carefully now, "is less about documentation and more about whether helping people who saved my children's lives creates a problem for the territorial plan," she said. Not aggressively, just accurately. He was quiet. "Lieutenant Garrett," she said, "I've been a widow in this territory for 6 months. I have 2 children under a year old. I have a filed claim and documented neighbors and letters from established settlers attesting to the stability of current arrangements." She held his eyes. "What I don't have is any interest in being the kind of story that ends up in a report explaining why the territory became more complicated than it needed to be. And I don't think that's what you want either." He looked at the documents again. He was thinking, she could see it, the genuine thought of a man who was not entirely without conscience and was deciding what his report was going to say. "The Morrow Creek incident," he said, "is being handled through the Trading Post dispute records," she said. "Caldwell is involved. The records are there if you need to reference them." He nodded once. He closed the folder he'd brought, which she noticed he had not opened during the meeting. He stood up and picked up his hat. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "I appreciate your time." "Any time," she said. She walked him to his horse. She watched him ride east and stood in the afternoon light until he was out of sight, and then she let out the breath she'd been managing since he arrived. Pratt appeared from around the side of the cabin. She had been there the whole time, which Evelyn had asked her to be, because Garrett, knowing there was a witness, changed the temperature of the room in ways that were useful. Well, Pratt said. "Well," Evelyn said, "you're very good at that." "I've had a complicated year," Evelyn said. Pratt looked east where Garrett had gone and then back at Evelyn. "He's going to write a report that doesn't help you," she said. "But he's also going to write one that doesn't hurt you badly enough to be worth the names on those documents. That's probably the best you were going to get today." "That's what I thought too," Evelyn said. "It's enough for now." "What's next?" Evelyn looked west toward the settlement 12 miles away, toward Wren and Cutter and Alara and the community that had held her through the winter and was now, somehow, a community she was partly responsible for. She thought about Rowan, who would be ranging today and back by evening, who had said, "I'll talk to Cutter," with the same even voice he used for everything, who was building something in this territory that was going to be either possible or not possible based on 100 small decisions made by people like Pruitt and Caldwell and Pratt and Garrett and herself. "We build the record," she said. "More names, more documentation. We make the arrangement so legible and so attached to names withstanding that removing it becomes more trouble than anyone wants." She paused. "And we keep working, every day." Pratt considered this. "That's a long answer," she said. "It's a long problem," Evelyn said. She went back inside to her children and to the papers that still needed writing and to the particular work of building something durable in a place that was still deciding what it was going to be. The response from Denver came on a Wednesday in late July, which was the kind of day that made you believe the territory might actually be worth fighting for. Warm and clear and smelling of pine sap and cut grass. The sort of day that tricked you into thinking things were simpler than they were. Evelyn was at the settlement when Pruitt rode in with the letter. He had brought it himself rather than sending it, which told her before she'd even broken the seal that it was not simple news. She opened it at the table where she'd written the original petition 3 months earlier, with Rowan standing to her left and Wren seated across from her and Cutter at the edge of the room, doing the thing he did where he wasn't quite part of the circle, but was listening to every word. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table. "They're not signing the removal order," she said. "Not this season." Rowan said nothing. Wren looked at the letter. "Not this season," Cutter repeated. The specific weight he put on those 3 words said everything about what he understood, which was the same thing Evelyn understood. Not this season was not never. Not this season was a delay, a repositioning, a bureaucratic pause while the pieces on the board moved and settled. "They've acknowledged the trading record," Evelyn continued. "They've noted the homestead adjacency. They've logged the petition signatures. And they've assigned the territory a stability designation, which means before any relocation order can proceed, there has to be a formal review that includes documentation of disruption to establish commercial activity." She looked up. That's what Pruitt said we needed. Pruitt, who had been standing near the door, said, "It's not permanent protection. I want to be clear about that. It's procedural protection, which means the process has to be followed before action can be taken. It gives you time and it gives you grounds to contest, but it doesn't give you certainty." "Nothing gives us certainty," Wren said. She said it without bitterness, like a person stating the temperature outside. "No," Pruitt agreed. "But this is better than what you had in April." The room held that for a moment. Evelyn thought about April, about writing letters by firelight while May slept against her chest, and Daniel made the small, satisfied sounds of a baby who had recently eaten. About the feeling of building something out of words and hoping words would be enough. They had been enough for this season. That was what she had, and she was going to take it. "What do we do with the time?" Rowan said. She had been thinking about that since she'd read the letter the first time. "We make the stability designation harder to reverse," she said. "More signatures, more trade records. We formalize the arrangement between the settlement and the homesteading community, not informally, not as a courtesy, but as a documented economic relationship." She looked at Cutter. "The Morrow Creek route, the one the hunting parties use. I want that surveyed and documented as an established use corridor. If it's on paper with dates, it's harder to call a trespass." Cutter looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something to Rowan in their language, short, flat. And Rowan said something back that was equally short. And Cutter looked at the letter on the table and then at the wall and then, with the specific quality of a man doing something that costs him, he nodded. It was the closest he had come, in 7 months, to telling her she was right. She didn't say anything about it. She moved on, because that was what you did when someone made a concession that cost them. You didn't remark on it, you received it and moved forward, and that was how you kept the thing intact. The summer was the hardest work she had ever done, and she had done hard work. The cabin was fully repaired by the end of June. Rowan and 2 men from the settlement had come for a week in the 3rd week of the month, and what would have taken her the rest of summer alone took 7 days with hands that knew what they were doing. She had not asked them to come. Rowan had simply appeared one morning with the 2 men and her tools from the outbuilding and looked at the remaining work with the assessing eye he used for terrain, and she had felt something she hadn't fully expected. The specific difficulty of receiving help when you had spent 8 months becoming someone who managed alone. She had received it anyway, because she had learned in the winter that receiving help was not weakness, it was a skill, and like all skills, it was harder than it looked and required practice. The trading route documentation took most of July. Pruitt helped with the survey language. She and Rowan walked the Morrow Creek corridor twice on separate days, making measurements and notes that Pruitt then translated into the kind of language that appeared in official records. Caldwell signed the completed document along with 2 of his ranch hands who had used the same route for years and were willing to say so on paper. The 3 new families east of the creek, the ones who had talked to Garrett, whose arrival had felt like a threat in May, turned out to be more complicated than their early actions suggested. One of them, a woman named Doris Vance, had come west because her husband wanted to and had views of her own that weren't her husband's views, and she found Evelyn at the post one afternoon in late July and asked, in the direct way of someone who has been wanting to ask something for a while, what exactly the arrangement was with the settlement to the west. Evelyn told her. All of it. The winter, the twins, the documentation, the letters, the stability designation. She told it plainly without making it a story designed to persuade, just the facts in order. And she watched Doris Vance listen with the focused attention of a woman who is accustomed to being given less than the full picture and appreciates it when someone gives her the whole thing. "My husband thinks the clearing is coming regardless," Doris said when she'd finished. "It might," Evelyn said. "We're trying to make it cost more than it's worth to try." Doris was quiet for a moment. "My family back home thought coming west at all was too much risk," she said. "My husband thought the risk was worth it. I thought the risk was worth it too, just for different reasons." She looked at Evelyn. "If I signed something, would it help?" "Your husband's name would help more," Evelyn said, honestly. "My husband's name does what I tell it to do," Doris said, and the way she said it was so matter-of-fact that Evelyn almost laughed, and then did laugh, and Doris smiled at the sound of it, like a woman who hadn't heard enough of it lately. Doris Vance's signature went on the petition in early August, her husband's beside it, which Doris delivered with a look that said she had handled that particular conversation and it was not Evelyn's concern. Two of the other new families declined. Evelyn did not push. She had learned that pushing people toward what they weren't ready for produced signatures without weight, and signatures without weight were worse than no signatures because they suggested a consensus that didn't exist and would not hold. The thing she had not expected in all the months of building the paper record was how the record itself changed the territory. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where a single document changes everything in an afternoon, but gradually, the way water changes stone. People who had been uncertain about the arrangement began to treat it as settled. Traders who had been vague about their routes through the settlement's territory began to note them in their logs, because Pruitt had explained that noted routes were protected routes. Caldwell, who had come to the first meeting as a practical man looking after practical interests, had become something closer to an advocate, not because his interests had changed, but because the documentation had made the arrangement real to him in a way that a conversation hadn't. Garrett filed his report. Pruitt's contact in Denver sent a copy, unofficially, folded inside a letter about an unrelated land survey. The report was exactly what Pratt had predicted. Not helpful, but not damaging enough to move against the record they'd built. He noted the stability designation. He noted the homestead adjacency. He noted, with a careful neutrality that said more than the words themselves, that the current arrangement was supported by documented commercial relationships and multiple settler signatures. He did not recommend removal this season. Whether that was conscience or calculation, Evelyn could not tell and did not particularly need to. The outcome was the same. She had not thought about what she was going to do past the immediate problem. That was the thing about survival mode thinking. It occupied all available space, and when the immediate threat receded, there was a moment of disorientation, a sudden awareness of a future that had been theoretical for so long that it hadn't accumulated any content. She was sitting on the roof of the cabin on a late August evening. She had taken to sitting on the roof in the evenings, which was not something she'd done before, but which had become the place where she thought most clearly, when Rowan rode in from the settlement. He did that occasionally now, rode to the cabin rather than meeting her at the settlement. She had noticed the shift in June and not remarked on it, for the same reason she hadn't remarked on Cutter's concession. Some things stayed intact better when you didn't put words to them too quickly. He tied his horse and looked up at her on the roof. "You're going to fall," he said. "I haven't fallen yet." Yet is doing a lot of work in that sentence. She came down the ladder. They sat on the bench near the door the way they'd learned to sit together. Not too much space, not too little. The particular calibration of two people who have been figuring each other out for most of a year. "I got a letter from my mother," she said. "From Ohio." He waited. "She's heard about Daniel. She wants me to come home." She looked at the horizon, which was doing what August horizons did in Colorado, burning down slowly through colors that had no names that did them justice. "She doesn't know about the twins. I haven't told her yet. About how they came, about the winter, about any of it." "Why not?" "Because I didn't know how to tell it in a letter. Some things you can't flatten into a letter without losing what they actually were." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to write her now. I know what to say now." He was looking at the horizon too. "What will you tell her?" "That her grandchildren are well. That they know 2 languages, which is more than I can say for myself yet. That they are going to grow up in Colorado, which is hard and sometimes brutal and occasionally beautiful." She paused. "That I'm staying." He turned to look at her. "This is where I live," she said. The cabin is mine, and the claim is filed, and Daniel built it, and I rebuilt it, and my children know the sound of this fire and the smell of this wood, as someone once told me. She met his eyes. I'm not going back to Ohio. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark eyes that she had been learning to read since November, and had not entirely learned yet, which she thought might be the point. Some people were not fully readable, and that was not a flaw. It was just the honest nature of a person who was more than could be taken in quickly. Wren is going to say something, he said finally. Wren says things about everything. She's going to say it's about time, he said, and there was something in his voice, very slight, but there, that was not quite professional and not quite careful. She looked at him. Is that what you're saying? He was quiet for a moment. Not the evasive kind of quiet, the thinking kind. I'm saying, he said, that there is a future here that is not accounted for yet, that I've been ranging wider than necessary for the last several months, which you may have noticed. I noticed, she said, and that ranging wide has limits. He looked down at his hands. I have been trying to determine whether what I want to say is what I should say, because the circumstances have been complicated. They've been complicated, she agreed. You were recently widowed when I found you. I was. You've spent most of this year managing a crisis. I have. I didn't want to be... He stopped. Started again. I've watched men take advantage of women in difficult circumstances. I didn't want to be a version of that. She looked at him for a long moment. Rowan, she said, you have spent a year treating me like someone with full capacity for decisions. Don't stop now. Something shifted in his face. That's fair, he said. What is it you want to say? He looked at her directly, the way he looked at terrain, fully, taking the whole of it in. I want to know if the future I've been building toward is one you're building toward too, he said. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I'm asking if it's a question worth asking. She thought about November, the cold, the cabin, the moment she'd opened the door to this stranger standing back with his palms turned out. She thought about the trail, the fire, the way he'd said I sleep differently than you do, and I try to be honest. She thought about a year of watching a man do the things she had loved most about Daniel, and had not expected to find again so quickly or in such an unlikely place, the willingness to stop. To choose the harder thing because leaving the harder thing undone was not something he wanted to be. It's worth asking, she said. The horizon had finished burning. The first stars were coming in over the western ridge. Then I'm asking, he said. They did not rush it, because neither of them was the rushing kind, and because the territory around them was still complicated and requiring attention, and because some things are built more solidly when they are built slowly. But by October, a year after Evelyn and Daniel had arrived in Colorado with their trunks and their plans, there was a conversation with Wren that was not translated because Wren had decided English was sufficient for the occasion, and there was a conversation with Cutter that Rowan described afterward as brief and conclusive, which Evelyn took to mean that Cutter had said what he needed to say and then said nothing more, which was Cutter's version of a blessing and worth as much as anyone else's. Caldwell came to the small gathering at the settlement in November with his wife, who turned out to be a woman named Ruth with a dry humor and a comprehensive knowledge of territorial land law that she deployed casually in conversation as though everyone kept that information on hand, which made Evelyn like her immediately. Pratt came. Doris Vance came without her husband, who was apparently occupied, and said simply that she was glad to be there, and Evelyn believed her. The gathering was not elaborate. Wren had organized it in the way she organized everything, with the efficiency of someone who knows what a thing requires and provides exactly that and nothing extra. There was food, there was fire, there were people from both communities in the same space, which was its own statement, one that didn't need words. Rowan stood beside her, which was the primary fact. The rest was ceremony around that fact. Wren said something in her language. Rowan translated it quietly. She says a partnership forged in difficulty is not fragile. She says the winter tests what things are made of, and you have both been tested. She says welcome to the family, and she says it without sentiment because sentiment is not Wren's currency. And Evelyn had come to understand that the absence of sentiment in Wren was not coldness, but was a different kind of care, the kind that respects you enough not to perform on your behalf. Tell her, Evelyn said to Rowan, that I've known for a while that this is where I belong. Tell her I'm grateful she let me figure that out at my own pace, he translated. Wren looked at Evelyn and did the thing. The almost not quite, the adjacent. And for once it completed itself. A small, real, entire smile. Gone in a moment, but there. Cutter, standing at the edge of the gathering in his customary position, caught Evelyn's eye across the fire. He raised his cup slightly. She raised hers. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Daniel and May Harper Blackhawk. She hyphenated both names because both names were true and she was not going to pretend otherwise. And she put it in writing with Pruitt's help and filed it alongside the homestead claim, which she did because paper mattered and she had learned that thoroughly enough to live by it. Grew up in Colorado in a life that was not simple and not romantic, and not the life anyone had planned for them. May was, as Alara had predicted in the first winter, the one with ideas. By the time she was 4, she had opinions about everything and expressed them with a directness that made Wren, who found most children only marginally interesting, pay attention. She spoke both languages without seeming to notice she was switching, which Alara said was the sign of a child who had learned them at the same time rather than one after the other, the way a body learns 2 things simultaneously at the right age and carries them as one capacity rather than 2. She had Daniel's eyes, her father Daniel, the first one, the man who had built a table with an uneven leg, and Rowan's stillness when she was thinking, and Evelyn's specific inability to leave a problem alone once she'd identified it. Daniel was, as Alara had also predicted, the patient one. He learned things more slowly than his sister and retained them longer, which was a different economy than hers and equally valid. He was the one who sat with Wren in the evenings and learned the old stories, not because anyone told him to, but because he wanted to, the way some children are drawn to the oldest things in a room. He was the one who helped with the animals, who had Rowan's quality with living things that were frightened, the steadiness, the absence of large movements, the willingness to wait. He asked, at 6, where his first father was buried, and Evelyn took him to the place, a small rise east of the cabin where she'd buried Daniel Harper in the first week of December, before the worst snow. And she sat with him there and told him everything she could tell a 6-year-old about a man who had been good and had wanted to build something and had not had enough time. Was he brave? Daniel asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to answer his questions. He was brave in the way of people who don't think of themselves as brave, she said. He was afraid of things, like everyone is, but the being afraid didn't stop him. Is that what brave is? I think that's most of what brave is, she said. He thought about this with the patience that was his particular quality. Okay, he said, which was what he said when he had received something and needed time to put it in its place. The stability designation was renewed 3 times before it became something more permanent. Pruitt had aged into a man with more standing in the territorial office and used it on their behalf without being asked, which was the mark of an ally rather than a contractor. Caldwell died in 1889. A hard winter, a horse, an accident that was no one's fault. And Ruth Caldwell ran the Box C for 11 years after that, with the land law knowledge she deployed so casually, and she signed every renewal petition that came across her desk and sent it back the same day, without ceremony, because that was how Ruth handled obligations. The Morrow Creek corridor remained documented and contested and ultimately recognized, not because anyone with power decided it was right, but because the paper record was so thorough and so attached to so many names that disturbing it would have been more complicated than leaving it alone. That was not justice. Evelyn never called it justice. She called it what it was, a durable inconvenience to people who would have preferred otherwise, and a livable space for people who had needed one. Garrett moved on to a posting further west in 1888 and was replaced by a man named Okafor, who had grown up on a farm in Pennsylvania and had different ideas about what order meant in a territory. Okafor came to the settlement in his first month and sat with Wren for 2 hours and left with the careful expression of a man who had revised something important. He renewed the stability designation himself without a petition, which was the first time that had happened. Cutter died in the hard winter of 1890, which was not as hard as the winter Evelyn had survived in the cabin, but was hard enough. He died as he had lived, directly, without ceremony, having said what needed saying and left the rest unspoken. At the gathering for him, Evelyn sat in the circle for the first time without feeling like someone who had been permitted to sit there. She felt like someone who belonged there, which was a different thing. And the difference was not about acceptance from others, but about something that had finished settling in herself. some last piece that had found its place without announcement. Rowan spoke at the gathering in the old language, and she understood most of it, which would not have been true 2 years earlier. She understood that he was saying Cutter had been the kind of man a community needed, the one who asked the hard questions, who refused easy comfort, who made you prove that what you were doing was worth doing. She understood that this was not criticism and was not eulogy. It was the specific accuracy of a man describing another man he had respected and argued with and needed. She thought, sitting there, about what it cost to be Cutter, to be the one who never made it easy, to carry the skepticism so that others didn't have to hold the group's doubt so the group could move. It was a harder role than it looked from the outside, and she had not fully understood it until he was gone. She said so to Rowan that night. "I know," he said. He knew it too. He didn't expect to be thanked for it. "Did he know I'd come around?" Rowan was quiet for a moment. "He told me in the second summer that you were the most dangerous kind of outsider," he said. I asked him what he meant. He said, "The kind that becomes part of the thing." She sat with that. "Was that a compliment?" "From Cutter," Rowan said. "That was a declaration of trust." The cabin expanded twice. Once, when Daniel and May were 4, when they added a room on the north side because 2 4-year-olds had approximately the same amount of need as a small frontier operation, and once when Alara came to live with them for 2 years while she helped establish a school at the settlement, which was a project Evelyn had been building toward and had not expected to build with Alara, but found that Alara was the right person for it in ways she hadn't anticipated. The school was the thing she was proudest of, in the way that you are proudest of the things that happen because many people made decisions in the right direction rather than because one person had an idea. It began with Evelyn teaching reading and writing to whoever at the settlement wanted it, which was more people than she'd expected and included 3 adults who had been told their whole lives that literacy was not for them. It grew because Alara added the old language, the stories, the history, the way of naming things that was not her way of naming things, so that the children learned both vocabularies, both ways of seeing, and had more to work with than either world had been prepared to give them alone. Wren came to the school once. She sat at the back and watched Alara teach, and then she watched Evelyn teach, and then she watched the children ask questions in 2 languages and move between them without seams. She stayed for an hour and left without saying anything. That evening she sent Alara a length of beadwork that had been her mother's, which Alara understood to mean what it meant. Evelyn found out about it the next day and said nothing, because there was nothing to add. What she had learned, in the years that built on the winter that had nearly killed her, was something she had not been able to articulate while she was still inside the surviving of it. She had believed, arriving in Colorado with Daniel, that building a life was about finding the right place and the right person and making the right plans. She had believed that the variables were manageable if you were competent and committed. She had been wrong about all of it, not in a way that made competence worthless or commitment pointless, but in a way that required a larger frame than the one she'd arrived with. You did not build a life by finding the right conditions. You built it in the wrong conditions, with the wrong resources, alongside people you had not planned for, using skills you did not know you had until you had no other option. The winter had not been a setback from the life she was supposed to build. The winter had been the beginning of the life she actually built, and everything that had come from it, Rowan, the settlement, Wren, Cutter's reluctant nod, the paper record, the school, the 2 children who moved between worlds like it was simply how moving worked, had grown from that beginning. She did not know how to feel about the cost of it. Daniel Harper was still buried on the rise east of the cabin. She still thought about him with a regularity that had not diminished so much as changed shape, sharper sometimes, particularly in winter, and carrying a different texture in seasons than it had in the beginning. Rowan knew about this and did not treat it as a problem to be solved, which was one of the things she had come to understand was fundamental to who he was. He did not try to solve things that were not broken, even when they were painful. None made space for the pain to be what it was. That was harder than it looked. She had tried to learn it herself. She was still trying. The territory itself changed, slowly, incompletely, with the reversals and contradictions that characterized everything that was actually happening, rather than the clean arc of how people told it later. There were years that felt like progress, and years that felt like what they were. A fragile arrangement surviving on a combination of documentation and luck, and the practical self-interest of people who had more to lose from disruption than from tolerance. She never stopped updating the paper record. She never stopped being the woman who showed up with a letter when a problem needed a letter, who knew which name on a document carried weight and which didn't, who could sit across a table from a man with a folder he hadn't opened and make sure that folder never needed to be opened. Rowan ranged less wide as the years went on. Not because the territory needed less, it always needed more, but because the settlement had become something that needed less ranging and more building. And he was a man who understood what a season required and gave it that. He had the quality she had loved in Daniel of doing the thing that needed doing without requiring it to be noticed. And she had learned that this was not a common quality and should not be taken for granted. She did not take it for granted. She was on the roof on an October evening. She still went to the roof, still found it the clearest thinking place. When May appeared at the bottom of the ladder, 7 years old and carrying a book, and the expression she wore when she had decided something. "Mama," she said, "Alara says the story about the winter is true." "What story?" "That you and Baba walked through the blizzard with us when we were babies, that we almost died." Evelyn looked at her daughter, at the dark eyes that were her first husband's, and the stillness that was her second husband's, and the expression that was entirely May's own. "It's true," she said. "Were you scared?" Honest answer, always the honest answer. "Yes, very scared." "But you kept going." "Yes." May thought about this with the focused attention she gave everything she was deciding about. Why? Evelyn was quiet for a moment, looking at the horizon that was doing what October horizons did, burning colder than summer, the colors sharper, the light more deliberate. "Because you were there," she said, "you and Daniel, and being scared wasn't a reason to stop." May absorbed this with that particular quality she had of receiving things entirely before she responded to them. Then, "Alara says Baba almost didn't come up the ridge that day, that he almost kept going to his trap line." "I know. Why did he come?" Evelyn thought about what Rowan had said that night by the fire in the shelter, in the second night of the crossing, the night she'd asked why he'd come up the ridge, and he'd said, "I didn't want to be the person who kept walking." "Because he decided he didn't want to be someone who didn't," she said. May considered this. "That's a funny reason." "It's the best kind of reason," Evelyn said. "Come up here. Watch the sun go down." May climbed the ladder with the confidence of a child who has been told the roof is dangerous and has decided to respect the ladder rather than the warning. She settled beside her mother and looked at the horizon. "It's pretty," she said. "It is," Evelyn said. They sat there together in the cooling air, the two of them, while below them Rowan came out of the barn and looked up and saw them on the roof and said nothing, just stood there looking up with that expression she knew well now, the one that was not quite a smile, that lived in the neighborhood of it and was better for being understated. Daniel came out behind him and stood beside him and looked up too. 4 people on and below a rooftop in Colorado at the end of an October evening, which was a small thing and an enormous thing simultaneously, the way the most durable things tend to be, built from disaster, assembled from what was available, imperfect in every particular, and holding. That was what she had learned, not that the right circumstances produced the right life, but that people of a certain stubborn disposition could make something that held from the worst circumstances, if they were willing to do the work and receive the help and stay when staying was harder than leaving. She had been willing, she had stayed. The sun finished its descent behind the western ridge. Below, Rowan said something to Daniel in the old language, and Daniel answered in English, and Rowan answered back in both, which was how they talked, which was how the settlement talked, which was how the school taught, which was how 2 children who should not have survived a Colorado winter moved through the world, carrying more than one way of knowing it, more than one way of naming it, understanding that this was not a compromise but a fullness. May leaned against her mother's shoulder. Evelyn put her arm around her daughter and looked at the first stars coming in over the ridge, the same stars that had come in over the same ridge on the night she had followed a stranger into a blizzard, and decided that the terrifying, uncertain end was better than the familiar, slow one. She had been right about that. She had not known she was right at the time, which was how it usually worked. You made the decision in the dark, with incomplete information, afraid and exhausted, and without any guarantee. And then you lived it, day by day, piece by piece, until one October evening you were sitting on a roof in Colorado, with your daughter, and the life you had built was all around you, imperfect and real and entirely yours. That was enough. That was, she had come to understand, exactly enough.